day I met my wife, I was late to my own company's holiday party. I'd been stuck at a job site in Beaverton. One of the subcontractors had botched the framing on a load-bearing wall, and I'd spent 3 hours on the phone with the structural engineer trying to figure out whether we needed to tear the whole thing down or just sister the joists. By the time I got to the restaurant, my tie was crooked, I had sawdust on my jacket sleeve, and I'd already missed the appetizers. She was standing near the bar talking to someone from accounting. I didn't know her. She wasn't in construction. She'd come as a +1 for a colleague, and she was laughing at something. This real laugh, not the polished kind people use at work parties. I remember thinking she looked like someone who didn't care very much what anyone thought of her, and I'd always found that more attractive than almost anything else. Her name was Melissa. We talked for 2 hours that night. I drove her home because it was raining, and she'd taken a rideshare. She gave me her number without me asking. We were married 3 years later. I was 41. She was 36. Neither of us had been married before. For a long time, it was good. Better than good. We bought a house in Hillsborough, renovated the kitchen together, got a dog. My wife was a project manager at a mid-sized tech firm. Good at her job, well-liked, always the person people called when something went sideways. I was proud of her. I told her that. I thought we had the kind of partnership that was actually rare, the kind where you still genuinely like the person after the domesticity sets in. I'm telling you all this because I want you to understand that I wasn't naive. I wasn't some checked-out husband who stopped paying attention. I was present. I was invested. And it still happened. The first time I noticed something was off, it was a Tuesday in March. My wife had started a new role at her company about 8 months prior. Not a different company, just a promotion into a division she hadn't worked in before. Her new boss was a guy named Richard. I'd heard her mention him occasionally, always in a professional context. Sharp, demanding, running a tight team. I had no particular feelings about Richard one way or another. That Tuesday, she came home an hour later than usual, which wasn't remarkable on its own, but she was different. Lighter somehow. She made dinner and she was humming while she cooked, and when I asked how her day was, she said, "Long but good," with a smile that didn't quite match the word long. I filed it away without really knowing I was filing it away. Over the following weeks, there were other small things. She started going to the gym in the evenings instead of the mornings, which she said was because her schedule had shifted. She got a new perfume without mentioning it. She became slightly more private with her phone. Not dramatically so. Not the kind of obvious shift that makes a spouse suspicious all at once. But the phone just started going face down on the counter more often. She started having longer showers. None of these things mean anything on their own. I know that. I wasn't building a case. I was just noticing. The moment it stopped being vague and became real happened on a Friday night in April. We'd gone to dinner with my college friend Theo and his wife Paige. We'd known them for years. Easy company. The kind of dinner where you split 2 bottles of wine and lose track of time. Afterward, waiting for the car, my wife got a text. She read it, and her expression shifted just slightly. A small smile she tried to contain. She put the phone in her purse and didn't say anything. I didn't ask. In the car on the way home, she was quiet in a way that felt occupied rather than tired, like she was thinking about something that had nothing to do with the dinner we'd just had, or the husband sitting next to her. I didn't say anything that night, but I didn't sleep well either. A few weeks later, I was at a city permit office waiting on an inspection clearance, something that always takes longer than it should, and I ended up sitting next to a guy I vaguely recognized from the industry. His name was Phil. We'd met once or twice at contractor association events, nothing more than that. We got to talking the way you do when you're both bored and stuck in the same fluorescent lit waiting room, and at some point he asked what part of town I was working in. I told him. He nodded, mentioned he had a crew working near there. Then he said something that didn't mean anything to me at the time. "Hey, I think your wife works over at Kenmore Systems, right? I did some AV installation over there last fall. Ran into her a couple times." I said, "Yes, that's right. She's been there about 5 years." "She's always with that VP guy," Phil said, casually, the way people say things that are meant to be nothing. "What's his name? Richard something? They always seem to be in the middle of something." I nodded, said something forgettable. The conversation moved on, but I thought about it on the drive back to the job site. I thought about it more than I should have for something that was, on its face, nothing. That weekend I did something I'm not proud of, but I'm not going to pretend I didn't do it. I looked at the phone bill. We were still on a shared family plan, old habit from when it was cheaper that way, and I could see call logs through the carrier account. There was a number that appeared often. Not outrageously often, not 40 times a day, but consistently. Evenings, occasionally late, sometimes on weekends. I didn't call the number, I looked it up. It belonged to a Richard Calloway. LinkedIn confirmed he was a VP at Kenmore Systems. I put my phone down and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Here's the thing about a moment like that. You already know. Some part of you knew before you looked, which is why you looked. But knowing and having the thought confirmed are two very different experiences, and the space between them is its own kind of grief. I sat there and thought about all the ordinary evenings we'd had, all the meals and conversations and nights in bed, and I tried to figure out which ones had been real. I didn't confront her. I'm the kind of person who needs to be certain before I open a door I can't close. I needed to know what I was actually dealing with. I called my oldest friend, a guy named Chester. We'd grown up in the same neighborhood, played ball together in middle school, stayed close the way some friendships just persist through geography and life changes without either person really working at it. Chester lived about 40 minutes away, ran a landscaping business, and was one of those people who listened more than he talked, which was exactly what I needed. We met for lunch on a Monday. I laid out everything. The phone records, the behavioral changes, the text at dinner. I didn't editorialize. I just told him what I'd observed. Chester was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What do you need from me right now?" I said I needed to know for certain, and I needed someone who could help me think through what to do once I was certain. Chester nodded. He didn't offer false reassurance. He didn't say maybe it's nothing. He said, "Okay, how do we find out?" I had an idea, but it required something I was uncomfortable asking for. Chester's wife, Annette, worked in HR at a company that happened to share office space in the same building complex as Kenmore Systems. Not the same company, different floor, but the same building. I asked Chester if Annette would be willing to keep her eyes open, not investigate, not do anything that would put her in a difficult position, just pay attention. Chester didn't love the idea of involving Annette, and I respected that. I told him not to push it, that I'd find another way. He went home and talked to her that evening and called me back the next morning. Annette had agreed, and the way Chester said it made me think she hadn't needed much convincing. Over the next 10 days, Annette mentioned two things. The first was that she had seen my wife and a man leaving the building together on a Wednesday afternoon, not at the end of the day but around 3, which was unusual. They'd gotten into the same car in the parking structure. The second was that on the following Friday, she'd seen them come back into the building together at different times, about 10 minutes apart. That was enough. I went home that evening and made dinner. My wife came home at 6:30, kissed me on the cheek, said she was exhausted, poured herself a glass of wine. We ate. We watched something on television. She fell asleep on the couch. I sat next to her and felt something cold and settled move through me, and I understood that I was done. I didn't cry. I thought I would, but I didn't. What I felt instead was a strange, deliberate calm that I've never experienced before or since. Like every unnecessary feeling had been cleared out to make room for the one thing I needed to do, which was think clearly. I started making a plan. The first call I made was to a family law attorney named Helen Dorsey. I'd been referred to her years earlier in an unrelated professional context and had kept her card. I called from my truck during lunch the next day. I explained the situation in broad strokes. She walked me through what I needed to know. Oregon is a no-fault divorce state, which meant the infidelity itself wouldn't affect the legal outcome. But documentation could still matter depending on how contested things became. She told me to start organizing financial records, accounts, assets, anything in both our names. The second call I made was to a real estate contact I trusted. My wife and I had bought the house together, equal equity, and I wanted to understand what a clean separation would look like on paper before I said a single word to anyone. I want to be clear that none of this was about punishment. I wasn't trying to destroy her. I was trying to protect myself, and I needed to do it quietly before she had any idea I knew. Because the moment she knew, everything would shift, and I'd lose the only advantage I had, which was information. For the next 3 weeks, I went home every evening and acted like my marriage was normal. I made dinner twice a week. I asked about her day. I went to bed at the same time she did. I was civil and even warm because warmth was more convincing than distance, and because some part of me was still grieving the woman I thought she was, which made the warmth not entirely performed. She noticed nothing. Or if she did, she chose not to ask. Chester and I met again during that period, once for coffee and once for a beer after a Blazers game. He asked how I was holding up. I told him honestly, some days were fine and some days felt like being underwater. He nodded. Annette, he told me, had mentioned that my wife had brought flowers into the office twice in the past month, and that people on her team had been teasing her about being in a good mood. I absorbed that without saying anything. About 3 weeks in, something happened I hadn't anticipated. I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, there was a pause, and then a man's voice said, "Is this the husband? Melissa's husband?" I said yes. The voice said, "This is Richard. I think we need to talk." I pulled over. I had been driving to a job site in Beaverton, same stretch of road where I'd been the night I met her. Not that it mattered. I pulled into a parking lot and sat there. Richard's voice was controlled but not comfortable. He told me he'd been in a relationship with my wife for about 5 months. He told me he thought I knew, that my wife had told him we had an arrangement, that I knew about her seeing other people and that it was understood between us. He said he'd gone along with it because she'd been consistent and convincing about the details, but his actual wife, he had a wife, had found something on his phone that week, and when his wife had confronted him, the version of events he'd told her didn't hold together the way he thought it would. And during that conversation, his wife had said something that made him understand that my wife's husband almost certainly had no idea any of this was happening. He said he was telling me because his wife had asked him to. She had insisted on it. She thought I deserved to know. I listened to all of this without speaking. When he finished, I said, "How long did you say? 5 months?" He said yes, roughly. I asked if they had used my house. He hesitated. He said once when I was out of town for work. I thanked him. I told him I appreciated the call. I said I already knew, which wasn't entirely true at that point, but I wanted him to understand that whatever he thought he'd done for me, I didn't owe him anything for it. I drove to the job site. I walked through the building. I did what I needed to do, then I sat in my truck at lunch and ate a sandwich and thought about the fact that my wife had told her affair partner the same lie, the same exact mechanism that I now understood she'd likely used before. The arrangement. The husband who knows. It wasn't improvised. It was a system. That night I called Chester. He answered on the second ring. I told him Richard had called. Chester was quiet for a moment and then said, "What do you need?" I told him what I'd already been working on. I told him I was close to ready. I said I needed 1 more week to finalize a few things, and then I was going to leave. Not leave the house in a confrontation, just leave. Packed and gone clean. Chester said he understood. He said Annette wanted me to know she was on my side. I told him to tell her thank you, but that I didn't need her to pick a side. I just needed my plan to hold together for 7 more days. I'd been quietly moving money during those 3 weeks. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would look like concealment to a court. Just separating my personal earnings from the joint account in a way that Helen had told me was within my rights. I'd arranged a short-term furnished rental in Northwest Portland through a property contact who didn't know my wife and had no reason to say anything to anyone. I'd had 2 more calls with Helen and had all the paperwork staged. On the last night I spent in that house, my wife made pasta. We watched a documentary about national parks. She fell asleep against my shoulder on the couch, and I sat there for a while, not moving, because even when someone has shattered something you valued, the weight of them against you can still feel familiar. I don't know how long I sat there. Eventually, I got up, went to the bedroom, and finished packing the last 2 bags I'd been working on slowly over the previous days so she wouldn't notice. In the morning, while she was in the shower, I put my wedding ring and my house key on the kitchen counter. I left a note under the ring. It said, "I know about Richard. I know about the arrangement you invented. I've spoken to a lawyer. You'll hear from Helen Dorsey's office. Goodbye." I picked up my bags and walked out to my truck. The drive to the rental was about 25 minutes. I stopped for coffee. I sat in the parking lot for a while before I went in. When I finally carried my bags up the stairs and set them down in the living room of this small, clean, entirely unfamiliar apartment, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief, exactly. Something older and quieter, like setting down something very heavy you'd carried so long you'd stop noticing the weight. My wife called 6 times that day. I didn't answer. That evening she called Chester, who told her he didn't know where I was, which was technically true because I hadn't given him the new address yet. The following morning she called my office number, which went to my assistant. My assistant told her I was unavailable and took a message. My wife left a message. My assistant read it to me. It said, "Please just call me. Please, I'm so sorry. Please call me. Please, I'm so sorry. Please call." I did not call. The divorce took 7 months. It was not clean. My wife retained an attorney who argued for a larger share of the equity in the house on the basis that she had made certain improvements, which was partially true but not to the extent claimed. There were 3 mediation sessions. In the second one she cried, and the mediator called a recess, and I sat in a hallway for 20 minutes and looked at the floor and thought about nothing in particular. Richard's wife filed for divorce the same month. I found out through Chester, who found out through Annette, who had heard it from someone in the building. I felt no satisfaction about that. I didn't feel anything about it, which surprised me. My wife's affair with Richard did not survive the divorces. Chester mentioned later that she had apparently expected it would, and that learning it wouldn't had been difficult for her. I don't know if that's true. I didn't ask for details. The final settlement gave me 52% of the home equity, which Helen had argued for on the basis of my higher contribution to the down payment. My wife kept the dog, which I had suggested because she worked from home more often, and I thought it was the right thing for the dog. That was the part of the whole process that actually made me feel something when I signed it. Not the money, not the house, just the line about the dog. I moved into a proper apartment in the Pearl District about 2 months after the divorce finalized. 3rd floor, good light, quiet building. I got a houseplant, which felt like a ridiculous thing to be proud of, but I was. Chester and Annette had me over for dinner most Sundays for the first 6 months after I moved. I'm not going to dress that up or make it sound like less than it was. It kept me from disappearing into myself. Annette made too much food every time and sent me home with containers I didn't always remember to return. Chester and I watched games on Sundays like we were in middle school again. I don't have the words for what that kind of ordinary loyalty means when everything else is in pieces. About 8 months after the divorce was final, I was at an industry event, the kind of dinner I usually try to avoid, and I ended up seated next to a woman named Isabel. She was an architect, worked mostly on commercial projects, had a dry sense of humor, and a habit of being direct that I found immediately comfortable. We talked through most of dinner and exchanged cards at the end. I didn't call her for 3 weeks. When I finally did, she answered like she'd been waiting for a long time to hear from exactly this kind of awkward phone call, which made me laugh. Which made the whole thing easier. We've been together for 2 years now. We're not in a hurry. We talk about things honestly. She knows everything about what happened, and she's never once treated it as a reason to be anything other than straightforward with me. I don't think about my wife much anymore. When I do, it's not with the intensity it once was. Not the anger, not the grief, not even the confusion. What I mostly feel now is a low, settled awareness that I spent several years married to someone I didn't actually know, and that somewhere in that loss was also the beginning of a better understanding of what I actually want, which is something close to what I have now. That's not closure. I don't really believe in closure the way the word gets used. It's more like perspective. Distance. The difference between standing inside something and being able to see it whole. The house in Hillsborough sold last spring. I drove past it once on the way to a job site. Someone had redone the landscaping up front. Good choice, I thought. The original was always a little uninspired. I kept driving. People ask me sometimes, friends, mostly, people who knew me during that period, whether I regret how I handled it. Whether I should have confronted her sooner. Whether the months of silence cost me something I could have kept if I'd just spoken up the night I first noticed her phone going face down on the counter. I thought about that a lot. My honest answer is no. And here's why. What I did during those weeks wasn't avoidance. It wasn't weakness. It was the first time in years I had made a decision entirely based on what I actually needed, rather than what the situation seemed to demand of me emotionally. My wife had been operating on the assumption that I would react the way she expected, that I would fall apart, or beg, or make noise. The arrangement she invented for Richard's benefit wasn't just a cover story. It was a prediction about my character. She believed she knew exactly how I would respond to being betrayed. She was wrong. And that wrongness was the only card I had, and I played it. There's something I've come to understand about the way cause and effect actually works in a person's life. Not in a mystical sense, but in a very practical, observable one. The choices we make accumulate. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. The way water moves through limestone. My wife had been making a certain kind of choice for months, maybe longer. Each one was small enough to feel manageable, I imagine. Each one made the next one easier. By the time I was sitting at that kitchen table looking at a phone record with Richard Calloway's name on it, she had already built the architecture of her own consequences. I didn't construct them. I just declined to dismantle them on her behalf. That's the part people sometimes misread as revenge. It wasn't. Revenge would have required me to stay angry long enough to engineer her suffering. What I did was simply stop absorbing it. I got a lawyer, I moved my finances, I found an apartment, I signed the papers. And then I went and built something else. Jester and Annette. I think about them often. What they did for me during that period wasn't dramatic. They didn't investigate anything. They didn't scheme. They just showed up, repeatedly, with food and loyalty and a willingness to sit in silence when silence was what was needed. That kind of steadiness is its own form of intelligence. Knowing when to act and when to simply be present, that's not a small thing. That saved me from turning inward in a way I might not have come back from easily. What I'd tell anyone going through something like this is not to confuse stillness with surrender. The weeks I spent saying nothing, planning quietly, acting normal, those weren't weeks I lost. They were the weeks I found my footing. Intelligence isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like a man making dinner and asking about your day while he already knows everything and is already halfway out the door. The house in Hillsborough is someone else's now. The dog is fine. Isabel made me laugh on our third date so hard I had to put down my fork, and I thought, this is what I was making room for. You don't heal by forgetting. You heal by building something worth remembering instead.